Shall we begin? Okay. Sorry to confuse you. Thanks. Okay. Well, before I introduce our illustrious speaker, which probably does need no introduction whatsoever in this space, I want to. I have a message to give at the moment from the Greece Solidarity Group and Syriza London. This morning, the ECB has announced that they will stop all funding to Greece as of tonight. And this is likely to prompt capital controls from Monday onwards, right? So I think it's clear that this is a move designed to incite panic, it's highly undemocratic, and it's designed to put pressure to influence the outcomes of the referendum. Okay, so this is a moment in which we really need to build resistance to this. There's going to be an emergency meeting in Trafalgar Square at 6 o'clock tomorrow. Please spread the word, please be there. Please show our support for Syriza in light of this heavy-handed way, undemocratic way in which the European Union is dealing with the situation in Greece. So that's the message over. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, cleverly organised by the organisers of this to rally people on a Sunday morning at 10:30. Of course, David needs no introduction. He teaches currently at the University of New York Graduate Centre. And I'm sure many of you are aware of his video lectures on Marx's Capital. This has been an incredible, an absolutely incredible project that's led to Marx being introduced in a very accessible way to a whole new generation of activists and scholars. David just told me that they have a project at the moment through a wiki that allows people to translate these lectures into different languages, and currently there are 47 languages in which the subtitles have been translated. So we're lucky enough to have David here in person to tell us a bit more and to introduce Marx's Capital. So I'll just hand over to David to speak for about 20 minutes. Thanks.
First off, I want to disabuse you of something. I find myself these days being presented as an authority on Marx. Frankly, I don't think of myself as an authority on Marx at all. I often get Marx wrong, as many of you would probably tell me in the discussion period. I'm really not a Marx scholar either, in the sense that many people are. What I have been doing, however, over the last 15 years in particular, is become involved in something which in retrospect I call the Marx Project, which I say in retrospect because I didn't know I was doing it until I did it. And really it had a couple of aims. One was to do, as you said, make Marx more accessible. And I found myself thinking that most academics spend most of their time making Marx even more inaccessible than he already is, and that a case should be made to try to open a door to the interpretation of Marx. And my position on this was to open a door so people could go through and do with Marx whatever they wanted. This was something I learned very early on, teaching Marx, as I did pretty much every year for about 30 or 40 years. I had different audiences each time, and each audience read it differently depending upon where they were coming from and got different things out of it. And I kind of figured that rather than say, well, there's one interpretation of Marx, it's better to kind of say, look, let's read it together, and you know, you get out of it whatever you know is good for you, and then work with it. Which is why I called the books a companion to Marx's Capital, not an introduction. And so that seemed to me really an important way to approach it. The second thing was that it seemed to me that it was very important at the same time as trying to make Marx more accessible to try to demonstrate how modes of thinking that came out of Marx could actually illuminate what was going on around. So this produced a whole series of books about the new imperialism, neoliberalism, urbanization, and the like, to say, well, you know, if I'm reading Marx on the one hand, and then this also helps interpret what was happening in Second Empire Paris, or what's happening in contemporary sort of right to the city urban movements and things of that sort. And I think that all along, my approach to Marx was to kind of say, look, there are certain things which you can learn from Marx which are incredibly useful, certain things that don't seem to be so useful, and so there was a dialogue, if you like, between how I was reading Marx and understanding Marx, and how I was understanding processes of urbanization, uneven geographical development, geopolitics, and the like. So it was more, if you ask me to describe what I've been doing, it's more kind of practical application of certain ideas that come out of Marx. And behind this there lies, I think, a very important question, is that what is it that Marx can do for us today, and what is it we have to do for ourselves? And I think, of course, a lot of what we do today has to be how we do things for ourselves to understand exactly what is happening. At the same time, as I'm absolutely amazed, really, when you go back into Marx's texts, as how prescient he often was about certain things that might happen. For example, and this is relevant to what we're just encountering. Marx has a very interesting analysis of the Mistaken Bank Act of 1844, in which he talks about the way in which an institutional arrangement, i.e. the reorganisation of the Bank of England in 1844, contributed to what happened in 1848 and again in 1857. In other words, the institutional arrangement was such as to be totally ineffective in relationship to a crisis situation. And I found this a very interesting analysis, and it parallels exactly, I think, what one should say about the European Central Bank, that the European Central Bank was a profound mistake. What we're now seeing is a European Central Bank that cannot handle a crisis situation, and we have institutional arrangements within the European Union which are profoundly mistaken in relationship to what is going on. And I think that Marx's analysis of what happens under these circumstances, and he's very clear that mistaken institutional arrangements don't in themselves cause crises. What they do is they exacerbate crises, they make them far worse than they were, they prolong them, they deepen them, and make it much harder to get out of any mess which is created. And I found that it's sort of just an interesting insight about how to think about institutional arrangements and the dynamics of any particular situation. Similarly, in writing about many of these elements, like neoliberalization and privatization, commodification, of course, there's a lot of tools inside of Marx to understand what ways things work. But at the same time, it became very much more important for me to understand the kinds of constraints that Marx placed on himself in doing his analyses. And this is something that has got me into trouble in various circles, because it became clear to me that Marx is often making very partial arguments. For instance, the Volume 1 analysis of Marx is about the production of surplus value. It says absolutely nothing about the question of realization of surplus value through circulation. Therefore, Volume 1 analysis is profoundly biased. Actually, if you want to understand about realization, you have to go off and read Volume 2, because that's where realization is taken up. But in Volume 2, Marx makes the assumption that there's no technological change. Well, of course, technological change is fundamental to Volume 1 and is fundamental to understanding relative surplus value and all the rest of it, yet Volume 2 assumes it away. But you get a good understanding of the problems of realization in Volume 2. The problem, of course, is that a lot of Marxists read Volume 1, but nobody reads Volume 2. Or if they read it once. And I've had some very, important Marxists kind of say, well, I read it once and it was so boring and I couldn't get it, so I just left it aside. And you kind of go, well, actually, you've left out half of the notion of what capital is, because Marx talks about the contradictory unity between production and realization in the Grundrisse, and if you don't understand the contradictory unity between production and realization, you're not getting Marx's theory of capital at all. But if of course, you start talking about realization, you immediately find yourself accused of being a Keynesian, and you kind of say, well, actually, Marx couldn't be accused of being a Keynesian because, you know, and in fact Keynes got some of his ideas, you know, by a circuitous route from Volume 2 of Capital. So why then accuse me of being a Keynesian because I'm saying we should read Volume 2 of Capital? It's sort of crazy stuff like that starts to happen to you because there are certain, you know, ways in which Marx is conventionally read, and I think that it's very important to sort of open it up and recognize that Marx frequently builds what I would call restricted models under certain assumptions. For instance, the production of an industrial reserve army and the way in which the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which is one of the theses of chapter 25 of volume 1, that thesis is contingent upon certain assumptions. And one of the assumptions is that there is absolutely no problem of selling your product anywhere, that there is no problem in the market. It also assumes that there is no effect on all of this by the way in which the surplus gets divided up between rent, interest, profit on merchants' capital and production's capital. And the other thing is it assumes a geographical model under certain assumptions. And if you mention these assumptions and say all of these statements about the industrial reserve army are contingent upon those assumptions, people get mad at you because, you know, there's this nice statement about the rich get richer and the poor gets poorer, and you know, Marxists love to quote that, even though, you know, the reality is much more complicated. So this question of how Marx is working and in what ways he's working, and from the very beginning, one of the things I tried to do in using Marx to interpret what was going on in urbanization and uneven geographical development, one of the things that I found it very important to do was to actually understand how Marx was modeling certain parts of the economy under certain assumptions at certain parts in the text, which then look very different from another part of the text where he examines it in a different way. For example, at the end of Volume 2, Marx starts talking about how important it is to raise working class consumption because that's the only way in which you can square the market and get the market adequate for what is being produced. This is a completely different story from what you would get out of Volume 1. And you either say Marx is contradictory or you say Marx has two different windows which he's using to look upon the dynamics of capitalism, and he's seeing different things through different windows, and the reality is that there's a contradictory unity between these two dilemmas, and then you can use that to start to interpret the ways in which economies are working. So I find it very important to be very clear about the kinds of assumptions that Marx is using, and like I said, at the very beginning, one of the things I would do is to try to situate myself in the middle of Marx's argument and say, where's he going with this? And I'm not always sure I got it right, and in fact sometimes I have to reevaluate and say I got it wrong and I really is going here rather than there. But it's a brilliant text in lots of ways, and it's a lot of fun to play with. And when I say playing with it, I mean in a very constructive kind of sense, rather than sort of reading it in a sort of authoritative manner. I really don't think, after all these years, that there is any one single authoritative reading of Marx which works. I think there are multiple readings of it, and I think that actually what we have to do in a particular situation is to say, what is it that we're seeing in this text which is helpful to understanding the dynamics of what is going on today? I mentioned already one little way in which Marx sets up the Bank of England. I loved his characterization of the Paris bankers, the Second Empire, when he kind of said they have the magnificent character of being part swindler and part prophet. Actually, this is a very good way of describing the characters on Wall Street. They're prophesying what is going to happen at the same time as they're swindlers. You know, I mean, so it's kind of a very nice way of encapsulating certain things. So my approach to Marx then is not an authoritative one, and I don't, like I say, consider myself an authority on it in any way. I consider myself a practitioner. I think I find ways to read it in an open way, and at the same time that allows me to interpret some of the things that I'm very interested in, which is things like the transformations of daily life in the city, to address certain questions, which I'll talk about later, which is why is it that so much of the unrest in the city, so much of the political unrest that's occurred in recent times has been focused on the qualities of daily life in the city. Why in 2013 did you have things like Gezi Park, which wasn't a worker uprising in the ordinary kind of sense? Why did you have the uprisings in Brazil in 2013, which were about rising transport costs and the appalling conditions of life that were emerging in many of the major cities of the country? So if that's where a lot of the discontent lies, then why don't we have a good analysis of the production of that discontent? And I think that Marx actually helps on that if we interpret Marx right. But some of the interpretations of Marx don't do that because, like I say, they're locked in volume 1 and they don't look at volume 2. So this is, I think, the important thing for me. And I think one of the things I learned from publishing the companions, if I look at the sales of the companion to volume 1 and the sales of the companion volume 2, there's a huge gap between them. So it's still the case that everybody loves volume 1 and nobody likes volume 2. So I had people write to me and said, yeah, volume 2, we're not going to be bothered. I'm not going to have students read that. And I kind of write back and say, you know, you're missing half the story if you do that, and that's not good. So let me just leave it there as an introduction. I think I've spoken for 5 minutes. Well, I'll give the 5 minutes. I donate you 5 minutes to sort of get into this, because I'd much rather sort of hear discussion, debate, and questions, and get into a dialogue rather than me lecturing on and on and on. Okay, so let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us even more space for engagement and debate. Yeah, I'd like to open the floor up now for contributions and questions. We do have some time because of the generosity of David for giving us an extra 5 minutes, but I do ask you to keep your contributions to 2 minutes maximum, please. I have someone at the back. Is there a roving mic? Is there someone to collect the roving mic? Yeah, thank you. The man at the back there. Sorry, your mic's not on.
Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've recently read a book. It's called, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called The Zero Marginal Cost Society and the End of Capitalism. It's by a guy called Jeremy Rifkin. So it's not totally Marxist, but he's predicting the end of capitalism soon. I don't know if you've heard of it. When I've actually read it, and so because as it's predicting capitalism's demise, which we would all welcome, I wonder if what would be your insights into it. Thank you, anyway.
Yeah, I did read the book, and actually have now half forgotten what's in it. But it's raising this kind of question, which I think is very important. Of what do we? Well, there's a whole series of questions being raised now about the production of knowledge and the role of knowledge, and the sorts of innovations that are now being reproduced. And if you want to reproduce an automobile, then of course there's costs involved in that, and you can talk about the labour theory of value and all that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you want to reproduce a song, you can just reproduce it. It's zero cost reproduction. So a lot of the commodities that get traded are no longer have any labour content, but what they do have, and this is where the real problem comes in, is that people extract rent from them. So intellectual property rights has become very, very significant. And therefore capitalism has had to come up with ways to get a monetary gain, in fact rent, from many commodities which have zero production costs or reproduction costs. And once a piece of knowledge is available, it should be freely available. And of course there's a big struggle going on over intellectual property rights within the net and the like. And I think Rifkin's point was that to the degree that what you might call cognitive commodities are becoming more and more a hallmark of what capitalism is about, so you get a form, and there's another theory of cognitive capitalism, which kind of says that actually we're moving into a different phase in which the production of commodities is more about ideas, and it's more about questions of that sort. and that this then puts us in a radically different world in which the labour theory of value is no longer so relevant, because there's no labour input into the reproduction of a bit of knowledge. The original input is there, in terms of the labour of creating the knowledge, but once the knowledge is there, it's a free good. So we're having to, and so I think the idea that capitalism could evolve into a point where the free goods are essentially being traded would indeed mean that there was, we were out of capitalism. My point, however, is that what capitalists are doing is imposing rent charges, and therefore, bringing back. But this means that actually we are moving into a situation where the extraction of rent is becoming more and more significant for the capitalist class. And I think that actually this comes down to also things like property markets and things of that kind, that when you get speculation in property markets and people start to extract rent from rising property costs, they're not actually putting any labour input into it at all. It's all about playing games of this sort. And if that is the case, then the power of the rentier is going to come back in. And as you may remember, Keynes predicted that one day there would be a euthanasia of the rentier, but in fact the rentier is staging a big comeback. And what we're seeing in terms of intellectual property rights, rent on land and property, and we're seeing land grabs on resources and things like that, speculation on asset values. The capitalists themselves, the big capitalists, invest in the art market, and of course that's another one where this is, and then there's the whole kind of question of how much of the price of a commodity depends on reputation. So the manufacture of, say, Nike reputation actually adds to. So how do we calculate that in terms of relationship to the labour theory of value? So there's a lot of questions of that sort, and frankly, this is an area of considerable interest to me. I'm not quite sure what to make of the labour theory of value under conditions in which some of these elements that Rifkin talks about are significant, and which the trading of cognitive goods and with specific forms of production and so on. And this is something that, Negri and others talk about in some of the passages in the Grundrisse, where Marx talks about the general intellect and the creations of the general intellect and how significant they are when they become embodied in fixed capital and what the relationship is. So there are many, I think, some basic questions to be asked right now about Marxian value theory. And I think it's very, very useful, or it would be very useful to have some very serious reflection on how the labour theory of value is working under these current conditions, which seem to be not as simple as those which Marx was presuming.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to take maybe 3 or 4 contributions in one go now, so we can have all of a debate amongst the floor as well. So the gentleman here.
Hi. When you've written on urbanism, you've talked about the kind of limitation of local action, and most of us act locally. So I wondered if you could say some more about kind of how local action could be positively used.
And then there was someone at the back there. Any others could you indicate?
Hello there, David. Thanks for that. For those of us like myself who haven't read Volume 2, could you give us a brief summary? Not all of Volume 2, but just maybe hone in on Marx's theory of realisation for us. That might be really useful. Thank you so much.
And this lady at the front here, the woman at the front.
I've read a bit of Michael Roberts's work where he's talking about the current crisis and kind of locating it in a crisis of profitability. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. So I can see your point that we should read stuff about realisation as well as in Volume 2, but is there still a case to be made that there's a crisis within the production process, even leaving aside realisation temporarily?
I'll take one more. And then there's a question here as well. Contribution.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just going back to the thing about rent and wondering what you think of, or if you can comment on, I guess, kind of the importance of hardware still in terms of digital stuff and online stuff. That Apple is, I think, the biggest company in the world now. I don't know if that's correct. And how Google is now producing hardware as well, and so the interaction between kind of owning the platforms and still the importance of producing these commodities as well as the rent kind of in terms of online advertising. So.
Well, just on that, the hardware is terribly important. I mean, there is sometimes this imagination that everything that goes on in the ether somewhere, it doesn't. There's a lot of hardware involved, and we should always remember that. But it is also the case that Google, for example, when you ask the question, who produces the value in Google? And the answer is we do. And what Google does is extract rent from our activities. So we're the laborers who create all of the information base upon which Google extracts and then sells that, uses it to the advertisers and all the rest of it. So they're intermediaries, and they're extracting rent effectively off our labor. And this, of course, again, is one of the things that we're noticing, and this goes back to the zero cost thing a bit, that increasingly we are actually doing the labor. I mean, you check yourself out of the supermarket, you check yourself in at the airline counter, increasingly we're becoming what Alvin Toffler called prosumers. That is, we're both producing and consuming at the same time. And so again, this is a different kind of situation in which you wonder exactly how the labor theory of value is going to work. On the kind of question of, can I give an outline of Volume 2? Well, the interesting, you see, Marx in one of his introductions, his prefaces to Volume 1, kind of says he wants to understand capital as a flow, and in the flow of its constant renewal. And what Volume 2 does is to start off by looking at the flow, in which capital starts off as a certain amount of money, it flows into commodity markets, and people buy raw materials, means of production, labor power, and then that gets converted into a production process in which a technology is deployed to make a new commodity, and then that new commodity goes out into the market and is sold for the original money plus the profit or the surplus value. So it's a flow process. And so Marx starts to look at this flow process and ask questions, where can there be interruptions in this flow process? And the answer is there can be interruptions all over the place. If there's not enough labor power, the thing stops. If the raw materials aren't there, it stops. If the technology is not appropriate, it stops. If there's not enough money at the start, it can't start. If there's not, so each one of these links, these metamorphoses in the flow of capital, there is a potential point in which there can be a stoppage and a blockage. When people get the money, do they circulate it back? And this is one of the ways in which a crisis can set up. If I end up with money and then I don't spend it, then what happens to the flow of other people who are relying upon me spending it? So Marx actually starts to identify blockage points within this flow process. And to me, those blockage points in the flow process are points where crises could emanate and arise from. And when you start to look and you proliferate it even further and say, well, actually, there's also a problem of fixed capital formation. That is, the flow process is moving across a situation in which we've actually created a built environment. So one of my specialties, if you like, is saying, how does a built environment get created which facilitates this flow? And the odd thing about the built environment is it is not itself a flow, it is fixed. So you create airports in order to create the flow, but the airports are fixed. the ports are fixed, but the boats that go to them are not. So you get this kind of contradiction within the flows of everything. So volume 2 is very much about the flows. It's also very much about turnover time. And how do you coordinate the turnover time of capital, some of which require 5 years to complete? If you're building one of these big buildings, you know, it takes you 5 years to complete it, against the background of, you know, making ice cream, which has to be instantaneously consumed. You know, I mean, how do you coordinate all these different turnover times in a production process? How do you coordinate fixed capital? And so all these questions come in. And the irritating thing about Volume 2, which is why I introduced a lot of Volume 3 into Volume 2, is that Marx kind of keeps saying, well, the credit system is very important here. But what you also learn at a certain point in Volume 2 is if there was no credit system, then so much money would have to be hoarded, because you know, the capitalist who wants to replace machinery would have to hoard the capital to get the machine at the end of 10 years and then replace the machine. And so they'd have to hoard them. So much hoarding would go on that actually capital would be stuck. And the only way in that hoard can get released is that instead of saving it, what you do is you put a bit of money in the bank or whatever and get interest on it and so on, and lend it to somebody else until you borrow. So actually what Volume 2 does is to prove that there's absolutely no way in which a capitalist system can work without a credit system. And that the credit system releases vast amounts of money capital back into the system, and that becomes absolutely crucial. But Marx doesn't really say that. And then in Volume 3 he deals with the credit system, and that's why I took all that stuff about credit and put it into Volume 2 and said, look, let's put these things together. And what you then see is this interesting picture. And again, some people got sort of outraged that I mixed up Volume 3 with Volume 2 for that reason, but it seemed to me very important to do that, because then you could get a good idea of you know, why the credit system is so important. And once you, however, open up the credit system, you open it up to the swindlers and the prophets. And this is the point Marx makes, because one of the issues he's raising is why would a capitalist system tolerate an exploitative, speculative credit system? And the answer to that lies in Volume 2, although Marx never really kind of articulates it. This is what we have to do to kind of say, well, this is what you get out of it. And then, so Volume 2 is very much about all of these flows and interruptions in these flows. And we see that also fixed capital circulation is really problematic. And so you get waves of fixed capital formation, waves of formation of the built environment. And you find other things which become very, very complicated from the standpoint of understanding data, which is one of the things I have with a lot of people who use data. The amount of fixed capital in society is not determined by investment, it's determined by use. I can turn my house, which Marx would normally categorize as being part of a consumption fund, into fixed capital if I turn the basement into a sweatshop. And actually, when you start to look at what's going on in that other subprime area of microfinance and micro-lending, what is you're turning every peasant hut into a piece of fixed capital. At the same time as you're actually disinvesting in the fixed capital of of regular production by converting, you know, old textile factories into condominiums. They're moving from fixed capital into the consumption fund. So the amount of fixed capital in society depends on decisions about use, not about investment. Now, this is something economists have a terrible, terrible hard time getting around. You know, fixed capital should be amount of money. Okay, you can find out how much it's worth and all this kind of stuff. But then, with all these shifts going on with Marx, and Marx is very clever about understanding some of this. So Volume 2 is very much around these kinds of questions, which then leads to the argument that I've been having with Michael Roberts. You know, I mean, there's the trouble with Michael Roberts and so on is he has one idea of where the problem lies. My view is that actually all sorts of ways in places where capital can come unstuck, including in the Fed credit system, including in fixed capital formation, including blockages of speculative activity around, say, energy and raw material prices, that monopolization of means of production and the land grabs that are going on around the world right now, putting reserve rents And actually Marx at a certain point kind of says, actually the profit rate could rise if rents are reduced and taxes are reduced. But by the same token, if rents increase and taxes are increasing, then the profit rate will fall. So you know, so I have these problems, as it were, with some of the ways in which this one mechanism that Marx talked about in Volume 3, and it's very interestingly worked out, and that's one of the other things you find about Marx. He gets obsessive with things, and once he gets obsessive with things, he won't let it go. And he keeps on going and keeps on going and keeps on going into all the kinds of intricacies, and sometimes he gets down blind alleys. You know, I mean, we all do at a certain point. He wasn't, an infallible genius. And I think the falling rate of profit argument in Volume 3 is a cogent argument. It could operate under very limited assumptions. But my problem is that people then give me a graph of falling rate of profit and say, see, Marx was right. But actually Marx has one specific mechanism. But it turns out there are about 15 different ways in which you can get a falling rate of profit. And there's no single way that Marx identified, that there's no way of telling whether what Marx identified is actually the reason behind it. There are ways to try to get at that question, but a lot of the time, you know, people kind of give me the falling rate of profit, and then what they do is they kind of give me a graph and show profit rates are falling, and I say, well, profit rates can fall for all sorts of reasons, including, you know, rising rents, rising taxes, rising this or that, you know, I mean, all sorts of reasons why there may be a blockage. Did I miss a question? Okay.
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
Okay, can I open up to the floor again for contributions? Take a few, please. Lady, where's the microphone? Is it around? Who's got the mic? Oh, right, wonderful, thank you. The woman just in the middle here.
I think maybe I missed it, but there was a question about local action.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, I've always, I worked with Raymond Williams' concept of militant particularism, which, and I've used that several times, and some people have interpreted it as me criticizing it. In fact, I was saying, no, I think all political action at a certain level arises out of local circumstances. Therefore, I'm all in favor, you know, very much involved in local actions wherever I go. But the big question is, how do local actions become generalized, and how do they become broader social movements? And I think that Marx and Engels had a kind of interesting framework in the Communist Manifesto. They sort of started off by kind of saying, well, you have an individual person who's alienated and discontent. And if you put it in contemporary terms, you would say, well, you know, this is the level at which the personal is political. But they come together and they're assembled in factories, and so they start to recognize their common discontents, and so they start to organize around their common discontents at that place of employment. They then find there are other places of employment where people are discontent, so they may organize across a metropolitan region or something of this kind, or regional. Then they find that different regions have different have discontents, and so they come together around the, you know, saying, well, we should organize at the national level, and the final level is, of course, workers of the world unite. So this is actually laid out in the Communist Manifesto, that those different levels are there. One of the things they didn't say, which I think is very unfortunate, is that if a movement goes to the global level and it doesn't have a way of maintaining its base in the local, then it actually gets hollowed out. And we've seen many hollowed out left movements which are at the national level, and they've failed to maintain the vibrancy of their local animation and the like. So if you see this thing not as a simply translation from one scale to another, but see it as a dialectic of movement across all of those different levels of organising, then it seems to me you have what for me is a framework of thinking about the way in which the local contributes to global politics, and the way in which global politics can be articulated in relationship to local concerns. There's a lot of left activity these days, which of course is associated with autonomista, anarchist and other kinds of ways of thinking, which is heavily oriented towards local action, and there are wings of Marxism dealing with solidarity economies, worker occupations and things of that kind, which are very much about local action. My view of that has been, when I come across it, I would always be supportive of it, but I would also ask the question, well, how do you go from that level to the next level, and what kind of forms of organisation? At that point, the anarchists would say they will not tolerate anything other than something that's horizontal, and they will not tolerate anything that's hierarchical, which basically says to me, well, they're not prepared to go to any other level, in which point I say you're condemning yourself to disempowerment. But at the same time, as you see that there is danger of going to another level, and we see the way in which the left, when it comes to state power, often ignores its base and has forgotten to cultivate its base and becomes hollowed out. So there are a whole bunch of issues here about different spatial scales at which issues are articulated. And to me that is very, very clear on environmental issues. I mean, you don't see kind of global warming at the very, very local level. You don't see ozone holes at the very local level. You see there, you may experience the effects of some of that, but you don't understand it unless you're working at a much more global kind of level. But then the question arises, what forms of local action are possible in relationship to those global issues, or do you kind of say at my particular locality, what are we doing that really contributes to global warming? Well, we're going to continue to drive our cars and all that kind of stuff. Don't bother me with all this other stuff about getting out your bicycle and bicycling. So there's all sorts of questions that arise over that. But I'm very, very interested and have a very positive view of this idea of militant particularism, which arises out of very particular circumstances, and which then at some point or other starts to speak to universal questions.
Great. Yes, I'd like to collect a number of questions again and contributions. There's a woman at the front here. Oh, sorry, third row back. Yeah.
Is it all right for me to go back to the question of the cultural commodity or the knowledge commodity?
Mm-hmm.
Is it all right to go back to that? I'm not an economist, so I may make myself sound like an idiot, but I've been trying...
Well, you're lucky, actually. I'm not an economist either, so...
I've been trying to get my head round that, the idea that the stuff that ordinary people produce online, be it for Google or Facebook or what have you, is a form of exploitation, or is a form of labour, or productive labour in the Marxist sense. Right. And I'd be really interested to see where you think my thinking might be wrong on this, because it just doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me that the stuff that we produce on, say, a Facebook page is the raw material that is the basis for exploited labour elsewhere, the technical staff, the people who have to phone around, because Facebook makes its money by selling data to advertising companies. Yeah. So somebody has to package that data to sell to the advertising companies and keep the website going and keep all of that kind of the infrastructure going. And it seems to me that that's where the exploited labour is. That the labour that we do when we upload our stuff on Facebook isn't exploited labour. It's not productive labour in the sense that Marx talks about. It's a different kind of labour, just like if I was a pop star and I went to, sing at the house of Richard Branson, I wouldn't be exploited labour, it'd be a different kind of labour. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And I guess the reason I think that's important is because of everything that we do is this kind of labour that is in some way manipulated, and it's not, and we don't lose that idea of exploitation. Because because exploitation seems to be a double-edged thing.
Mhm.
On the one hand, it's shared, but on the other hand, it's the place where we organise collectively, and we have the kind of potential power to fight back against that exploitation. And if we lose that when we think about the kind of commodities that are coming out of the internet, then it's just very depressing, isn't it?
Okay. Would it be okay to collect a few more contributions?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Just in front of you. Sorry. Please indicate if you have any other contributions, anyone has any. Great.
Thank you. I would just like to ask you how you would interpret this Greek crisis and what you predict would happen.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that's fine.
Hello. I've thought about Marx really for a while, so thank you for reminding me. I've never read the second volume. But I'm involved locally in gentrification and grassroots stuff. And it seems easy to help in a particular situation to stop something happening. But the large question of the interrelationship of state politics, squeezing local politics in terms of money, whereby they have to realise their assets through housing, which means that poor people have to move out. It's such a large issue. I wondered if we can bring Marx into that at all. I've not found any help coming from that direction with gentrification.
There's a man on the fourth row in the middle here.
Regarding to Capital Volume 3, as you correctly mentioned, credit initially was fundamentally important for manufacturing sector in order to, as you mentioned, that reducing the time of circulation. However, the financial sector, as further developed, he started its own function beyond manufacturing sector, and as a result of that, as Marx mentions, developed speculation, and Marx talked about fictional capitalism and Ponzi scheme, that apparently Ponzi scheme of following 2008 capitalism crisis, it appears that apparently that Ponzi scheme it is a new one. But in volume 3, Marx talks about the Ponzi scheme and fictional capitalism, and now a big chunk of capitalism apparently shares in the stock market. It is fictional capitalism and has no connection with the real production of labor.
Can I take the question of the lady in the striped shirt as well? Are there any others who would like to contribute to this round of questions? Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to ask what your analysis is of what's sometimes referred to as the sharing economy and things like Uber.
Yeah, well, that question and the question from over there, I think there are a lot of things happening in the economy right now, and I reiterate what I said earlier, that seem to me to raise the question of how does the labour theory of value work in contemporary situation. Frankly, I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. I want to think about it, and I think we should have a collective attempt to talk about this. I think the issue of where exploitation lies, I think in a certain respect there is exploitation in the field of production. And if you say who is producing the knowledge on Facebook, for example, then we do. And to some degree we are being exploited in terms of the way in which we're producing that knowledge. But there is another point of exploitation, which is the point of realization, and the organization of realization, and the organization of the extraction of rents from all of this, which is another point of exploitation. So you have 2 points of exploitation. This comes back to the flow. If you analyze the flow and say, well, there's a point of exploitation here and there's a point of exploitation there. Actually, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels talk about, the worker is exploited in terms of the living place, and then when the worker gets home, what happens? Has to face the landlord, and so there's exploitation at another point within the circulation process, and that's why the Volume 2 analysis is so important, because it is about the flow, and you get a good sense of the flow, and you get the sense that there's different points at which exploitation can occur. For example, if you're using an Apple computer, it's produced by Foxconn probably in China. The data suggests that Foxconn itself is making a 3% rate of profit, i.e. the profit rate on Foxconn is very, very low, because the exploitation rate is very, very, and the rate of exploitation of labor is also very, very high. Apple, that sells the computers in the United States, has a profit rate of 27%. Okay, so you have 2 points in the circulation process, the computer being built there and then being sold by Apple in the United States. And Apple gets 27% because Apple does some other things other than just selling, but I'm saying that the merchant capitalist part of this circulation process is extracting far more of the value because it can put pressure on the direct producers. Walmart does exactly the same. Walmart puts incredible pressure on the producers, and they are reduced to kind of almost zero rates of profit, whereas Walmart, and we know, is one of the most profitable enterprises in the world right now, and the Walton family is the richest, family in the world. So wealth is being extracted at different parts of this flow process. And it's only when you see that flow process as a whole that you really come up with a notion of exploitation. Now, Volume 1 of Capital talks about exploitation in the labour process and, to some degree, in the wage market. It doesn't talk about these other forms of exploitation. And I think you're quite right to differentiate between these 2 forms of exploitation, but I think there's 2 forms of exploitation. In other words, it's not as if there's zero exploitation here and there's exploitation somewhere else. There's exploitation at both points. But the rate of exploitation is much, much higher now. In Uber and all this kind of stuff, again, you have something which is supposedly a sharing economy, but it's being highly organized and rents are being extracted like crazy from it. And it gets capitalized immediately. And again, exactly where the exploitation is occurring and how that exploitation is structured becomes really very, very important. So I think, but again, how we match that with sort of conventional views of the labour theory of value is not clear to me at all. And I kind of think we need to have a real good discussion and debate about that. I mean, in my own writings, I find ways to slip around it, and I kind of find a language which kind of gets me off the hook, but I know I'm on a hook on this one, and I think we need to have an open discussion and debate. Now then, what was the other question? I would distinguish between fictional and fictitious. I know it sounds silly, but Marx doesn't talk about fictional stuff. He talks about something called fictitious capital. And the category of fictitious capital is laid out in Volume 3, and I think it's a very important category. And I've always stuck with it since Linus to Capital, which was published years and years ago, as being very significant. And by and large, it tends to be ignored because people don't know exactly what to do with it. There is always, within capital, I mean, this is the thrust of that Volume 3 argument, there is always within capitalism a segment which is dealing in fictitious capital. And it's necessarily fictitious. And again, Marx, I think, is always looking for what is necessary for a capitalist system to work. And basically he argues in volume 3 that capital cannot work without, at some point or other, generating something called fictitious capital. The interesting question is, in a certain kind of way, actually all of capital is fictitious. Because you start off the day with a certain amount of money and you're guessing that you're going to end up more at the end of the day. So the fictitious capital becomes real in the process of circulation. So there's a sense in which all capital has a fictitious moment, and you cannot avoid that. But then what Marx does is, particularly in the chapters on there, is to say, well, actually, any revenue stream can be capitalized. So the state will look at its taxation flow and then kind of say, I can capitalize this. And I go to the banking sector and I say, capitalize this revenue flow as if it is an interest rate, even though there's no production going on, and I'm going to use this, you know. So the state is specialist in circulation of fictitious capital, and it will spend it on a war or something like that, or, you know, or it will spend it on, you know, the leaders will build themselves huge mansions or something like that, you know, sort of. So the fictitious capital side of things is terribly important to look at this as a certain kind of flow. And Marx's point, I think, is that there's no way in which you can avoid this. And I find this interesting, because there's often this notion that somehow or other the credit system and the financiers have disconnected themselves from the whole system. That is not what he's saying at all. He's saying they are integral to how this system works. You cannot have a capitalism that does not generate the circulation of fictitious capital. But the interesting question is, how does that fictitious capital does it get realized or does it not get realized at the end of some sequence of investment decisions? Like, if the state capitalizes its tax flows and says, all right, I now have X $1 million, and the state can say, I can build a bridge, you know, across, you know, Golden Gate Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge or something like that. And they build the Brooklyn Bridge, and then the point is, well, is the Brooklyn Bridge contributing markedly to the productivity of, say, the New York economy? And I think the answer is yes. That the flow of traffic across the Brooklyn Bridge is such as to allow the economy to work in a much more efficient way than if you had to take everything by ferries and load it on and off. So the Brooklyn Bridge is therefore a productive asset. Now we're seeing vast amounts of this going on in China right now, with vast amounts of fictitious capital flowing into the production of physical infrastructures. And the big question is, are they going to produce, in the long run, gains in productivity? Maybe, and maybe not. We never know. We will not know for several years. If you look at, for example, the investment of the US state in the interstate highway system in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s, I think there's absolutely no question whatsoever that the investment in the interstate highway system led to major gains in productivity and connectivity within the US economy. And that therefore all of that money that was capitalized in, say, 1955 to build these big chunks of highways was got back by the fact that the tax revenues, which initially got capitalized, increased because of the increased productivity and increased activity, and that therefore the money comes back. But if it doesn't come back, then you'll get a fiscal crisis of the state. Okay, and so you often have phases of fiscal crisis of the state because a lot of the money that's been put into that does not actually produce the gains in productivity that were envisaged. And there's a big question right now in China of all these huge investments in physical infrastructures. If they're going to so improve productivity that, you know, 5 years down the line, everything is going to be, you know, earned back, or whether 5 years down the line we're going to have a fiscal crisis of the Chinese state. So these are the kinds of questions. Question about Greece. It's over. really is over. And I was of the view that 4 or 5 years ago, Greece should have got out of the euro and them. At the time I said something like, well, this is like, you know, if you have a real bad toothache, you either have the tooth pulled out and you're in pain for, sharp pain for a few days, or you leave it in there and you have a grumbling pain for 25 years, and they chose grumbling pain for 25 years, and it's got so grumbling right now that it's going to have to be extracted under the worst kinds of conditions. All that's happened on the European side is that what they've done is they've socialized the debt, so it no longer is located in the banks. It's been taken over by, you know, the IMF and the European Central Bank and the Troika. So if they had defaulted back 5 years ago, it would have been clear to everybody that the problem was the banks that had lent the money, and the banks were the German and the French banks. Right now, nobody's blaming the German and the French banks for lending them money at all. They've been let off the hook, as you know happens everywhere. You know about this is a neoliberal trick: protect the banks and suck it to the people. So they protected the banks and sucked it to the people. Now, Greece is going to dissolve into a really chaotic situation. I think there's no question about it. The only interesting question is, are there social movements which are prepared to actually collectivize in such a way as to turn Greece into a rather different kind of economic system? The example I would use of something where this is happening is Rojava in northern Syria, where the Kurdish population is organizing a completely different political structure in a destroyed environment, physically destroyed. I mean, 80 or 90% of the properties are destroyed in Kobane, and it's going to be a chaotic situation. It's going to take a street organisation to get out of it, and who has the street organisation right now? The fascists. They've got territorial organisation already in place, and so I'm very pessimistic about what may happen. But this comes, I think, from a failure on all sides, and at the same time, you know, the Europeans, I think, are going to deeply regret. So they've told this story that the only problem with Greece was lazy Greeks, and they should pay, and nobody should, you know, do anything else to help them. I think they're going to deeply regret the story they've told, which they've now pinned themselves into and can't get out of, because they're going to have to deal. I mean, if the fascists start to take over, what will the European Union do? What will they do? I mean, and we're not talking about sort of the mild fascism that you see around. We're talking about, you know, what will Europe do? And it will either have to go in there with emergency aid on such a level that they never dreamed of doing before before all this started, or they're going to let Greece go. And if they let Greece go, then that is an extremely sensitive region of the world. And, you know, what's going on in Syria and what's going on, you know, all that region. This is going to be a disastrous future. But I don't think that there's anything that, you know, can be done to rescue the immediate situation. Not right now. I mean, I wish there was, but the Europeans are not going to change their mind. They can't. And the Greeks can't change theirs. So the die is cast, and we'll see what happens.
Thanks. We have time for a very quick round of contributions, questions and answers, particularly on a contribution to the contemporary labour theory of value. I think that David did call for that as well, whether we could have that discussion briefly. Yes, one minute at the front. Any other indications from the floor? Yeah, so one minute at the front and then another. Oh, was there another question?
So you just pointed out there's going to be a lot of gentrification later. So
we'll talk about gentrification stuff later.
Okay, just very quickly on a comment on that last point you were talking about Greece.
I don't see it in quite such a pessimistic way at all, because I think the fact that Chypros has refused to accede to the demands of the quote-unquote institutions must be a consequence of the pressure from below. That therefore means that there is sufficient organisation and social movement, and there has been a social movement against Golden Dawn, to actually push the government into saying no and going to the referendum. Now, I agree with you that it is a breathtaking situation to find ourselves in, but I would just think it is very important to point to that fact that the working class in Greece and the social movements in Greece have actually fought and fought and fought and have been pushing for to say no to further austerity, and therefore what we have to do is a solidarity movement with that. But I am more optimistic than, even though it's going to be enormously difficult, than I think you are.
Well then, by the pillar back.
I disagree with the last speaker. I think David's right. The situation in Greece is one where certainly for the last 6 months, the government has had to be doing what? Directing all its attention to both Brussels and Berlin. And what we've seen is huge quietness amongst many of what were social movements developing and active over the last 3 or 4 years. It's a much, much more difficult thing now. There's been a huge diffusion, I think. And what we are going to see in this next 5-6 days is real panic and real worry about what is going to happen to people's lives, because they can see what's the future of it. And it's not being totally pessimistic, but it is something that I think is going to be immensely hard. The question I was going to ask is actually one that I don't think we've got time to answer. But out of all the work that you've done on capital, I wonder whether you'd just say something about 17 contradictions.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask David to sort of sum up and respond in a minute and a half, if that's possible.
Yeah, I visit Greece quite a lot, and my impression is that as Jane says, that the attention has been all on Brussels, and that they have not been organising in a preparatory way. Now, that may turn around. I mean, I hope it does. I think it's a situation that's an emergency situation. 17 contradictions. I consider it my most dangerous book. So if you haven't read it, read it. It raises the question of 2 questions. One is, what does it mean to be anti-capitalist? A lot of people talk about anti-capitalism, but don't really have a good analysis of what actually that entails. But then it makes an argument as to why you should be anti-capitalist, because it talks to the way in which the contradictions, certain contradictions, have become so unsustainable. Not necessarily the ones that bothered Marx most in his time, but for our time there are certain contradictions which are, I think, paramount, and that they have, what they do is they create a situation where any sane person looking at the situation should be anti-capitalist. And this is not an emotional argument, and it's not derived from some defect in my DNA. It's arrived at by an analysis of the way in which that flow process, and particularly contradictions between production and realization and the like, are actually creating such tensions in society that there's no way that we can look forward over the next few years to actually, creating a decent life for ourselves in a decent living environment without actually finding an alternative to what capital is about. And this is, of course, one of the things that could emerge out of the Greek situation, that new systems of barter and structures and so on can be devised, and surviving can be devised, which are outside of the normal structures of commodity exchange and outside of the power of monetary configurations, which are the sorts of things that are being experimented with in Rojava, in the Kurdish area, and there are other examples around the world where small versions of this are going on, so there may be the possibility of turning this crisis situation in places like Rojava and now Greece into some other channel, which is a non-capitalist channel. And to me that is one of the important possibilities that exists right now, but in order to grasp it, we need to have forms of organisation that clearly understand the nature of the problem and have already gone some way to figuring out the nature of the kinds of solutions that might work.
Thanks very much. Before we thank David Harvey for his contributions today, I just want to re-announce the emergency meeting tomorrow at 6 o'clock in Trafalgar Square in response to the ECB's announcement for cutting funding to Greece as of tonight. So on that, thank you very much for your time and for your